Welcome to Why Is This Good, a podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine and I'm here with John. Hey, John.
Hello.
Okay, so it's my turn, and this time I chose a story that was actually a suggestion from one of our former co-hosts, Rob.
The original co-host. Well, the original published co-host.
That's right. So we had asked people who have been on the podcast in the past to suggest stories, and this was one that Rob suggested. It's called An Outpost of Progress by Joseph Conrad, and I think we all had to read Heart of Darkness.
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah, it was like a seventh grade thing. I'm like, is this appropriate?
Your middle school reading list is crazy.
I swear it was middle school. This was not high school. I swear.
No, you mentioned other things you read in middle school. I was like, I didn't even know that existed until college.
I mean, I was in honors, but we should have only been like a year ahead, nothing like crazy. The two men watched the steamer round the bend, then, ascending arm in arm the slope of the bank, returned to the station. They had been in this vast and dark country only a very short time, and as yet always in the midst of other white men, under the eye and guidance of their superiors. And now, dull as they were to the subtle influences of surroundings, they felt themselves very much alone, when suddenly left unassisted to face the wilderness. A wilderness rendered more strange, more incomprehensible by the mysterious glimpses of the vigorous life it contained. They were two perfectly insignificant and incapable individuals whose existence is only rendered possible through the high organization of civilized crowds. Few men realize that their life, the very essence of their character, their capabilities, and their audacities are only the expression of their belief in the safety of their surroundings. The courage, the composure, the confidence, the emotions and principles, every great and every insignificant thought belongs not to the individual but to the crowd that believes blindly in the irresistible force of its institutions and of its morals, in the power of its police and of its opinion. But the contact with pure, unmitigated savagery, with primitive nature and primitive man, brings sudden and profound trouble into the heart. To the sentiment of being alone of one's kind, to the clear perception of the loneliness of one's thoughts, of one's sensations, to the negation of the habitual, which is safe, there is added the affirmation of the unusual, which is dangerous, a suggestion of things vague, uncontrollable, and repulsive, whose discomposing intrusion excites the imagination and tries the civilized nerves of the foolish and the wise alike. Kayerts and Carlier walked arm in arm, drawing close to one another as children do in the dark, and they had the same, not altogether unpleasant sense of danger which one half suspects to be imaginary. They chatted persistently in familiar tones. "Our station is prettily situated," said one. The other assented with enthusiasm, enlarging volubly on the beauties of the situation. Then they passed near the grave. "Poor devil," said Kayerts. "He died of fever, didn't he?" muttered Carlier, stopping short. "Why," retorted Kayerts with indignation, "I've been told that the fellow exposed himself recklessly to the sun. The climate here, everybody says, is not at all worse than at home as long as you keep out of the sun. Do you hear that, Carlier? I am chief here, and my orders are that you should not expose yourself to the sun." He assumed his superiority jocularly, but his meaning was serious. The idea that he would perhaps have to bury Carlier and remain alone gave him an inward shiver. He felt suddenly that this Carlier was more precious to him here in the center of Africa than a brother could be anywhere else. Carlier, entering into the spirit of the thing, made a military salute and answered in a brisk tone, "Your orders shall be attended to, chief." Then he burst out laughing, slapped Kayerts on the back, and shouted, "We shall let life run easily here. Just sit still and gather in the ivory these savages will bring. This country has its good points after all." They both laughed loudly, while Carlier thought, "That poor Kayerts. He is so fat and unhealthy. It would be awful if I had to bury him here. He is a man I respect." Before they reached the veranda of their house, they called one another my dear fellow.
What an auspicious beginning.
Yeah. To jump ahead to my takeaway, when I read that first paragraph that I read, I was underlining half of it and realizing that it's been a while since I think we've read a story where not just that they state their point plainly, but so early
Yeah.
on and almost at the beginning before you've even gotten started.
Your takeaway might be similar to mine.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I'm not a huge fan of it this way. I think that these kind of blunt, in your face, this is the point, this is what I'm trying to tell you, that left alone, when you're scared, your character, that's your true character, right? Whatever the conclusion of this paragraph is, I feel like, and maybe this is like I said, I'm a modern reader. I expect it to be sort of like earned, like the writer has to earn it. The writer has to show me these things in scene, in story, so that I can maybe draw the conclusion myself or something similar to it, or maybe they beg the central question or they ask the central question with that whole setup. And then by the and maybe they've earned a paragraph like this where they can state it really bluntly, but also poetically, and succinctly. I mean, this sounds like high school English papers that say, in this paper, I will show you that your character is tested in the heart of Africa. And then it
Yeah.
starts on the story versus like, here's the story. And the conclusion, if you didn't get it completely, is that this is what happens when your character's tested. So I thought it was interesting and I was underlining it like crazy. And then I was glad that that was it. It was only really this first page that he did that. And then the rest of the story, I think, unfolded in a pretty chronological way. And we could kind of see how it starts and how it ends.
There are a few moments when he does kind of return to that editorial style. Like
Uh-huh.
later on, there's a thing where it says they're thinking about, they don't like the guy that's with them, with his family, the African who's kind of does work around the camp.
Makola.
Makola, yeah. And then I think it's after the other people come and like attack all the other villages, but I don't know
Uh-huh.
if they've dealt with the ivory yet. But it says, fear, the wicked people were gone, but fear remained. And then it says, fear always remains. A man may destroy everything within himself, love and hate and belief and even doubt. But as long as he clings to life, he cannot destroy fear, the fear, subtle, indestructible, and terrible, that pervades his being, that tinges his thoughts, that lurks in his heart, that watches on his lips the struggle of his last breath. Like you said, it's like in the beginning, there's like this moment, there's maybe another one here and there. They're small, they're very subtle, where instead of speaking to the scene, it speaks to a
Right.
universal kind of truth, quote unquote
Right.
truth, like a universal kind of like not edict, but like observation about how people behave. And then we return immediately to portraying that truth. Like now watch it in action, watch fear in action within these two men.
Yeah, this is maybe like a weaker example of it, but you're right. He returns to the editorializing like throughout. And in some places it feels like the easiest, fastest way to describe what's happening over the course of many weeks or
Yeah.
months. Like the other section that I sort of like summarized was how they're getting ill, but it's just like they're not actually sick. It's not the fever, but their bodies are kind of like wasting away. And there's a paragraph, it left them weaker and their appearance changed for the worse. And it just kind of describes them as being like irritable, hollow eyed. It just kind of like lists exactly what's happening instead of like letting you guess as the reader. You know what I mean? So he has the tendency to editorialize, and maybe it's like I said, to sort of speed it up. But then there's those overt things where it's like, I'm going to talk to you about the universal truth of humanity and also the
Yeah.
point of my story. But like it's a style that it seems like he's comfortable with, and it works in these pieces, I think, that are longer. I mean, you have to cover all this ground. So what are you really going to do?
It is an interesting question about whether it's editorial and like a kind of this is Conrad's own voice coming in here.
Yeah,
I'm thinking
right.
about the ending where the people from the company show up on the dock and like there's all this fog and then Carrots is like waiting overnight and then during the night they start hearing Makola comes out and says we need to ring the bell so they can find us. And Carrots is like, oh crap, they're coming. I just
Right.
killed the other guy. I've lost myself out here in the wild. My character has been revealed. But it says so there's some shrieks, rapid and piercing, like the yells of some exasperated and ruthless creature rent the air. Progress was calling to Caerts from the river, progress and civilization and all the virtues. Society was calling to its accomplished child to come, to be taken care of, to be instructed, to be judged, to be condemned. It called him to return to that rubbish heap from which he had wandered away so that justice could be done. Now, in some way, we could say that that's Joseph Conrad saying this is what it means when they show up on the dock, right? It means that Caerts has to confront the civilized world outside of this, and that's what going to drive him to his final end. Or we could think of it as Caerts's perspective. Like these are Caerts's impressions of what's coming out of the river. He's thinking of him as progress. He's thinking of him as society and those who levy justice for his crime because he knows he's committed a crime and shooting somebody. It's not stated. We don't know for
Yeah.
sure. And Joseph Conrad writes in a way that isn't tightly limited to perspective.
Right.
It's kind of like broad. He'll like point the camera here and point the camera there where characters don't know what's going on. So in general, we think of it as editorial, as like his
Right.
perspective. But especially in that moment, I can see that as being more Caert's than Conrad.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess the paragraph I read for me did a lot of heavy lifting in terms of what I'm supposed to take away from the piece, you know? And I think that can be helpful. I think if you've ever been told that your writing like left some questions lingering, you know, or if there was like ambiguity at the end there, and maybe you're one of these writers that likes to pretend like, you know, oh, there's multiple ways to interpret it, you know. But I think for the most part, like we want to be understood, you know, for whatever it is we were trying to get across. And if people are wondering a lot about your pieces, like in a workshop setting, he didn't ruin anything in his piece by telling us up front, you know, what he thinks. He doesn't call it a wilderness, but it's like a jungle. What does he describe it as? Oh, I guess he says wilderness. Yeah. Wilderness to me suggests like no civilization, but there are civilized people here. We just don't think of
Oh,
them as civilized. You know what I
no,
mean?
yeah. We don't think of them as civilized.
Yeah.
That's part of the underlying racism.
Yeah. Oh, it is. It is. It's just like when you these days when we say wilderness, I think we mean like miles and miles of snow.
Untouched.
Yeah, exactly. Anyway, yeah, so I think you can just mitigate that by writing a paragraph. And this is, I think, like beautifully, expertly written, you know? It's not just like throat clearing, like, by the way, this is what I'm trying to get across. Okay, here's the story. It's presented in a way that's earned its place here, you know? It's writerly. So I think you can do that, whether it's at the beginning or the end. And this is like kind of proof that you can still then go on to read the story kind of with that in mind, right?
Yeah.
It's the same way that like we always are verbally telling each other stories, you know? Like someone will cue someone up and say like, "Oh, you know, the other day at Subway they shortchanged me." And then someone will chime in and say, "That reminds me of the time." And it's like we're already primed at that point. We know why we're being told the story, but it doesn't change each of the things that unfolds as this person tells you the story for the first time, right? We know they're telling us the time they were shortchanged, and they're
Yeah.
indignant about it for the same reason, but we're still listening. So you can still set it up.
Yeah, a lot of our interchanges, our intercourse with other people is kind of on topics, right? It's like
Yeah,
you're talking about like, man, people are dumb. And then everyone shares a story about someone being dumb.
I
And we
know.
all know that that's what we're doing. And
Yeah.
not on a conscious level. We haven't decided, oh, ooh, we're talking about dumb people. It's just like your story about a dumb person reminds me of my story about a dumb person. And then
Right.
like we just go around the circle and it's competitive too, right? And the next person always
Yeah.
has to, oh no, you think that person's dumb. Let me tell you about this
Yeah.
person.
Exactly.
I think what happens is like this story was written at a time, and we are modern. Like we can't help but be affected by not only what we read, what is contemporary writing nowadays, but the kind of education we've had as writers, all the books about
Right.
writing. Because when Conrad was writing this, there were no books that had chapters called show, don't tell, right? There
Right.
were no chapters that said focus on the character. He didn't read books about how to write. He just write other people's writing and kind of took it all in and then came up with his own way of writing things. There were no classes about, not in the way that there are now with their MFA programs and such. So nobody was telling him show, don't tell.
Yeah.
And who's to say that that's like a style thing? That's just the show don't tell thing is just what we do now. There's nothing that's better or worse about it. In some ways, his way is better because we know more clearly what we're looking at. He says, look at these characters lose it. They are losing it. And I want you to watch them lose it. Whereas if he didn't say that and we just had to watch, we're like, okay, what are you showing me? What am I trying to figure out? It's like there's more work to be done as a reader in that way. So I think it's not better or worse. It's just a different choice, right? And
Right.
so my takeaway was going to be to do that, to literally tell us what you're doing
Right.
as you're writing something. And if you want later, you can go follow the MFA rule books and take it out. That's fine. That's easy. But just to do it so that you can center yourself, right, as a
Right.
writer, so you know what you're doing. And then it'll be easier for you to expect the reader to get it.
Yeah. Like you said, it's easy enough to take it out. And I would argue it's easy enough to like insert it later, you know? Like
Either way around. Yeah.
yeah, you could though, like as an exercise, just decide to write one page where maybe you think of it as pitching your novel or whatever, but you just plainly, explicitly state what your intention with this piece is. And I guarantee you there's going to be like a couple sentences that you're really proud of, you know, that just like really get to the heart of it. And instead of earning its place on the 10th page of your short story and trying to like insert it into cleverly into dialogue, like you said, you can just state it. You can just do it up front.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work.
And if you can write as well as Joseph Conrad can and putting those statements in, they're seamless. Like no one's going to care. They're going to be like, oh, it's brilliant. It's brilliant.
Yeah. I mean, even the section this first paragraph that I read starts in scene, you
Yeah.
know, and by the end of that paragraph, he's pontificating.
We could read 100 authors and they all do this to one degree or another.
Yeah. He just did it pretty plainly up very early on. And I don't know if Heart of Darkness was before or after this, but I mean,
I was curious reading this, what order they were written in, because there are some some themes that overlap, right?
Heart of Darkness, 1899, April. An Outpost of Progress, 1897.
He's working up to it.
Yeah, so Outpost of Progress was published in 1897 and Heart of Darkness was 1899. I read this knowing about Heart of Darkness, and so I was already kind of queued up for the things that he plainly states here, just
Yeah.
knowing that this is the type of work that he was known for. So I think maybe it's important to keep that in mind too. I might have read this and thought to myself, like, I didn't really need this. I kind of knew what I was in for. But if you don't know Joseph Conrad, or you don't know that maybe a couple of his works are around, his time in Africa, then it might be necessary or helpful.
I have to say that I really like just Conrad's like scene building and like, obviously he has a style that I would probably tighten, but it's so well done. I was very engrossed. Like the chase at the end where like they
Yeah.
wind up shooting it, like the confusion of the moment and like he hears the sound and like I as a reader, I know that he just shot that guy and killed him. And he doesn't know and he's like going the other way and then he finds a body and is like, what's this? What happened here? Like he sells his confusion so well, even though I
Yeah.
know what happened. That's a feat, right? To be able to
Right.
have the perspective be that we know what the narrator doesn't know or what the character doesn't know in the
Yeah.
scene without spelling it out. Like this is not an editorial moment where Conrad pulled us aside and said, all right, now Kayertz is going to shoot Carlier and not know that he did it. No, let's
Right.
watch. And
Let's watch. Yeah, I was surprised too that how into it I ended up being by the end because I mean, for as much as time as we spent just now talking about show don't tell and how you don't really need to do it, the parts that were in the scene were like really exciting, right? Like,
oh yeah.
and the parts where knowing what we knew from his setup, where these things were sort of falling into place, where McCullough, brings these men and all this ivory, but then steals all their free labor. All of these like mounting sort of tensions where these two main characters, I mean, we know from the jump things are not going to turn out, but we don't know how exactly it's going to unravel. And it's almost as if Conrad's like champing at the bit to get to this part where he can show you where and how these two particular men lose their shit, like you said, It was
Yeah.
almost like the stuff leading up to the part, I would argue to the part where, like I said, McCullough has those men come in and like they're there overnight and he tells them to stay in their tent or in their little hut. He's like, don't worry about this, I got it, and then they hear someone get shot and they wake up and that's like a major, major, major turning point, and that's where
Yeah.
everything goes like wildly downhill because that's when their morale is gone.
They're like, we need ivory. And McCullough reminds them, you need ivory. And then he's like, I'll handle it. Let me
Yeah.
sell off these villagers into slavery. And they're like, oh
Yeah.
crap. Did we just sell slaves?
Yeah, yeah. They're like, no, that was McCullough. It's like, you guys are such idiots. Yeah, but mainly it's like the turning point, like, because the morale is just gone, right? It's just shot. And it's like, until then, they were able to kind of look around every day at things happening, whether or not they were productive, and tell themselves that things are according to plan somehow. But it was probably slipping then. And then this just like sent them over the deep end. And that's when it felt like the story really kicked into high gear, right? Because now it's like, you've set it up, but you set it up for this purpose. We knew this part was coming. I don't know. I guess you have to do all the setup beforehand. And it is interesting enough to start where I read the two paragraphs as a snippet where it's like these men, they don't really care for each other. They're sizing each other up and looking at each other like, yeah, you're technically in charge, but whatever. And like, I don't really know you, but it would really suck if you died. And by the end, they're like, yeah, we're BFF. And like, even as they say it, they kind of are hoping that the other one buys it because they know that the success of their mental health and everything is dependent on both people buying in. As soon as one person were to even articulate, like, I don't know if the steamboat's ever coming back for us, like that would crush it. You know what I
Yeah,
mean?
it's very late. They never acknowledge how late it is.
Right. Like it's supposed to be 6 months and then it's like, oh, it's 8 months. Yeah. So my point being that like, even though the story does kick into high gear, it's important to know that like, even from the beginning, this was a tenuous connection between these two men. They were not best friends. They became fond of each other through circumstance and not of each other specifically so much as like, this is the other white dude. I got to stick with him.
The shallow veneer of
Yeah.
civilization.
Yeah, and that's all it was, right? Because then as soon as the free labor is gone and they have like 5 sugar cubes left and the food kind of sucks, everything goes
Yeah.
to shit.
So both of our takeaways were basically tell us what's going on, and then you can keep it in or take it out if you want later.
Yeah. And like I said, I enjoy stories that I feel like earn it by the end and just kind of hit us over the head with it. But there's something to be said for setting it up
Yeah.
too. So
It's like
maybe
a
if you have a
thesis
paragraph
statement.
at the end, yeah, exactly. Like maybe you can just make it your thesis.
But we should point out that what he did really well was keeping us in scene. Even those moments when he stepped aside to tell us, we were in the middle of a scene when it happened.
Yeah, in the middle of the scene, and also this was being told chronologically, and so we never really lost track of where we were in the overall descent, right?
Yes.
And he wasn't like summarizing things like, oh, and then this one time this happened. No, he like starts at the beginning and just shows us how this went downhill like
I
very
did like
quickly.
and 5 months passed like that.
I know. That's kind of what I mean when I say that, like, you could tell he had to write the beginning half of this.
Yeah.
He really wants to write the part where they're running around with guns. But it's all of the little, like you said, where Kayerts is like in denial that he's even killed this man. It doesn't just speak to the fact that he was confused in the moment of the gunfight. It's also, he doesn't think of himself as someone that would kill his coworker. You know,
Yeah.
he's like, oh, that didn't happen. I'm a civilized man. It's like,
I wouldn't
no.
shoot an unarmed man.
Yeah, he is also working to connect all of those dots for us in a really convincing way. You know, I mean, like, I know this is not a guy that like wrote this story from his cabin in Ohio. Like, he saw some of this stuff firsthand, but like, good job. Good job, Joseph. Thanks, guys. Yeah, and thank you, Rob, for suggesting it.
I would really care. I wish I knew what Rob would have said, what his comments would be.
If you enjoyed this episode, consider joining our Patreon. Your support helps us keep the show running. Find out more at patreon.com/whyisthisgoodpodcast. And for industry news, writing tips, and great short fiction, join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/Naples Writers Workshop. You can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter at napleswritersworkshop.com.